Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Thanks for joining me again. Today's lecture, we're going to kind of pick up where we left off, and we're moving through this period, kind of the run-up to really one of the climatic moments in our nation's history. And of course, that is the American Civil War, where this country kind of literally and figuratively tears itself apart, where Americans go and actually kill each other over their differences, right? And we've been kind of highlighting those differences in this class really since almost the very beginning, right? I've kind of pointed out since at least when we establish our independence or declare our independence in 1776, there have been these growing divergences between the North and the South. Well, here in the 1850s, those lines are becoming pronounced. You can't ignore them anymore. Remember, Americans are trying really hard, both in the North and the South, to kind of paper over these differences, to kind of put things off as best they can. But it's getting harder and harder. Events just won't let you. Things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act start tearing America apart. Americans are killing each other in the Kansas territory, right? Americans are attacking each other in the halls of Congress, like in the Preston Brooks, Charles Sumner affair, where Brooks attacks and almost kills Sumner for his views. So what we kind of see here is this country is starting to fall apart. And especially in the Dred Scott decision, it's clarified really what this is all about, right? Remember in that famous court case, infamous one actually, because it was such a horrific decision, the Supreme Court really said that people like Dred Scott weren't people, right? That they were property, they were things. They had no legal standing in this country. And that meant that slaves could be taken anywhere and everywhere in this country, but especially in the federal territories, right? You could not be denied owning your slave in a federal territory, even if it had declared itself a free territory or was on its way to becoming a free state. So this kind of brings us to this moment where the country falls apart. And one of the things I want to bring home here, right, that I've been kind of subtly, or maybe even not so subtly at times saying, is what this war is all about. Over and over again, there's really just one thing that's driving Americans apart, that makes the South different than the North, right? Keep this in mind. It is just one thing. They both like to make money. Northerners and Southerners both want to get rich as quick as possible. Northerners and Southerners both see the West as a gateway to that opportunity, acquiring more land, as spreading American ideals, right? The idea of one man, one vote, universal manhood suffrage, as it's called in the 19th century, although it's not universal, right? They definitely believe in a lot of the same things. They believe that this country has a manifest destiny, what American historians call American exceptionalism, right? That we're a special nation destined for special things. All those things Northerners and Southerners can agree on. So what's the one driving force in this wedge between the North and the South? Well, of course, it's what makes the South distinct, right? We talked about that in earlier lectures. The one thing that is different in the South than the North is the presence of slavery, that Southerners have come to depend and see slavery as a defining cultural institution, right? They can't see the South without slavery. That is what is at the core of all of this. The only thing to fight over in Kansas is what kind of state it's going to be, free or slave. That's the only thing they're killing each other on. Why does Preston Brooks attack Charles Sumner? Because he attacks slavery, and Brooks feels he has to defend it. So over and over again, slavery is the cause. And that's the one thing I hope you get from this class, is that there's a clear issue here that is driving this country apart, that is going to tear it apart and lead to this terrible war that's going to kill almost a million Americans, right? And that is the issue of slavery. We've kind of seen how people have tried to hide from it. They've tried to ignore it, but it just won't be ignored. It keeps coming back over and over again. And the reason why I'm highlighting this, right, as we kind of move into this first lecture on the Civil War, where we're kind of setting things up, is this is still kind of an issue today, right? There's a reason why historians like myself and others that teach these classes try to really hammer this point home to our students. And that's because there are still a lot of Americans, especially older Americans, that don't maybe see this as clearly as we do, right? As historians do, and younger people, like most of my students are. Give you an example here. One older American kind of summed it up this way. Uh, People don't realize, this person said, the Civil War, if you think about it, why? People don't ask that question. Why was there civil war? Why could that one not be worked out? Well, as I've tried to point out over the last several lectures, they are trying to work it out. The Compromise of 1850 is them trying to work things out. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is them trying to work things out. Even going back further, the Compromise of 1820 and the Ordinance of 1787 and the Articles Congress that split territory, they were constantly trying to work these things out. But by the 1850s, neither side, the North or the South, was really willing to compromise on this issue, this one issue, right? Northerners didn't want to see slavery expand. Southerners felt that if you limited the expansion of slavery, then you'd have the power, the ability to get rid of it altogether. So they competed against each other for territories out west and eventually in a war against each other. Now, again, why does this quote matter so much? Well, it's not so much that it's expressing some high ideals here, right? As you can kind of tell from the garbled syntax, it's really kind of hard to understand what's being said here, right? But the point is that this is said by the President of the United States about a year into office. So even the President of the United States doesn't really have a firm grasp on this subject, right? And honestly, he's like a lot of older Americans. They've been told all their lives that it's hard to understand. It was just a tragic moment. Well, it's not. It is a tragic moment, but it is not hard to understand how we got here, right? There's one thing driving this. If you take slavery away, if you say that if we were to be able to go back in 1776 and say, hey, slavery's done, we're not fighting for to keep slavery, we're going to get rid of it. Once the war's won, once we have a country, we're getting rid of slavery. This Civil War doesn't happen the way it does. The same states aren't involved the way it is, right? I'm not saying there couldn't be a civil war, but it definitely won't be over that issue. So stop and think about it that way, right? This is an important moment. This is an important subject, and we definitely have to understand how we got there. So again, if there's one thing you take out of this class, the next time you hear somebody like this, maybe an older relative saying, well, you don't really know what the Civil War is about, you can say, actually, we kind of do, right? They're fighting over slavery in Kansas. They're fighting over slavery in the Congress. They're about to kill each other over the issue of slavery. That is the one thing that is different between the North and the South. Almost everything else is the same. Farmers in the North and South, right? They like to make money in the North and South. There are banks in the North and the South. The difference is slavery. So to kind of study this, we've got a few subjects here, right? To kind of explain how we get to this moment. We'll kind of look at those events in the late 1850s, kind of picking up where we left off last time, that explain kind of the high stakes that Americans feel are here now in the United States, especially in the political arena. We'll culminate that with a look at the election of 1860, when the nation actually does tear itself apart because of those election results. And then we'll kind of move into the war itself. We'll look at the first shots fired in the Civil War at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and then we'll kind of get down into the issues. What do these two sides, the North and the South, have to do to be successful in this war, to get their aims through, right? To actually do what they want to do, what they're fighting for here. So that's kind of what's on tap in this lecture and what we're going to kind of move through. Now, of course, we're going to kind of pick up where we left off, right? Looking at these events in the late 1850s that are really going to kind of tell most Americans here in the United States at that time that you can't ignore this anymore. You kind of have to choose a side here. Right? If you're a Democrat, you have to decide what your issue, how you feel about expanding slavery into the West. If you're a Republican, you've already made that choice. Now you've just got to convince more people to join your party so that your party can take control, right? So here in this period, right, the stakes are really high. Things are really happening. And we kind of see in the aftermath of that really horrific Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott, those stakes are elevated, right? In 1858, about 9 months, 10 months after the Dred Scott decision is kind of fully disseminated in the United States, we hold congressional elections. They're what we call midterm elections. So it's not a presidential election year. It's the election that happens in between where we elect members of Congress. Well, here in the 1858 elections, Republicans do great. They pick up almost every northern state is under their control now. They pick up Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, and even New Jersey, all northern states. Remember, the Republican Party is a northern party. It is for northerners by northerners, right? It's about their interests, their aims. And of course, one of their aims is to limit the spread of slavery. So again, remember, not an abolitionist party. They have not committed themselves to the idea of abolitionism as a party. They're members of the Republican Party, they're abolitionists, but that is not the party stand yet. But one of the big things we see happen in this election is the power of Northern Democrats, right? Remember, the Democratic Party is trying to remain a national party. It's trying to remain a party that can appeal to both Northerners and Southerners. But it's hard to do that now. And Northern Democrats, they're getting voted out of office left and right because they can't take a stand on the issue of slavery. That's the only thing that they're really being questioned on, that they're being tasked on now, is what is your position on slavery? Are you for it or against it? Can slavery expand or should it not expand? And when Democrats don't have an answer, they end up losing to Republicans that do have an answer. So we see a lot happening here. And there's one famous series of debates that comes out of this election period of 1858 that really kind of crystallizes the problems for Northern politicians, especially Northern Democrats, and really kind of how well Northern Republicans are getting at honing their message and really bringing it home. And that's, of course, what happens in the state of Illinois. It has to elect a new senator. And of course, they have a senator already for their state, and that's Stephen Douglas. He's the guy that's been around in election politics since 1844 for the Democratic Party. He's really seen as the future of the Democratic Party by Northerners. They think that he's going to run for president soon, and they're right. He is going to run for president. Stephen Douglas is the guy that came up with the idea of popular sovereignty. Let these territories out west decide for themselves, places like California, whether they want to be free or slave states. Of course, that wasn't very popular with Southerners, so he kind of changed his tune. Remember, he's the one that proposed the Nebraska Act, right? Let's bring Nebraska in as a state, a free state, so it can help pay for a transcontinental railroad. And when that didn't work, he was willing to shave off part of the state of Nebraska, turn it into a territory that was now open to the expansion of slavery, just to get the country bigger and to build up this infrastructure that most Americans agree needs to be done. So Stephen Douglas is the epitome of what's happening here to the Democratic Party. He's trying to be amenable to Southern interests while still promoting what's good for Northern interests. Northerners feel that he's looking out for the South more than the North, and Southerners don't trust him because he's a Northerner. Now, on the flip side, his opponent is a young guy from Kentucky originally that's moved to Illinois and has lived there for decades now. And he's a well-known lawyer in the area. He's very folksy and homespun, which means kind of he's a common man, an everyday kind of guy. He's not formally educated like a Stephen Douglas, but he's still pretty effective in the courtroom. And now he's gotten into politics. He was part of the Whig Party in the 1840s. Now he, like a lot of Northerners, has transitioned to the Republican Party. And during these debates, his opponents, people like Douglas, label him a black Republican. And what they mean by that is not that he is African American, but that he supports African Americans. That people like Lincoln want African Americans to be free so they can come and take your jobs. Right? That's the message that a lot of Northern Democrats are throwing out at Republicans. Lincoln, on the other hand, says, hey, look, I just want to limit the spread of slavery. I'm not talking about abolition. Now, privately, he does. Privately, he says, well, I think slavery is a bad idea. We need to get rid of it. But publicly, because he knows most Northerners aren't there, his public stance is limit the spread of slavery, just like the Republican Party. So here in these debates, right, Northern politics is on display. They're going to speak 7 times throughout the fall of 1858, establishing their positions, what their take on things is. And of course, the most famous of these debates takes place at Freeport, Illinois. And there, Lincoln really does kind of crystallize things, right? This is in the aftermath of the Dred Scott decision, and Lincoln kind of proposes an idea to Douglas. Hey, look, what's more important here, right? The will of the people that have said in a place like Wisconsin or Iowa that they don't want slavery. They voted it to make it free, a free territory, eventually a free state. Does their sovereignty matter, or does it matter what the Supreme Court says, right? Lincoln says, I support the people. If the people want a state territory to be free, it should be free. And the Supreme Court should not be able to undo their legal dictates. Douglas is caught in a hard spot here, right? Lincoln has just said, hey, popular sovereignty, the people of Wisconsin, the people of Iowa don't want slaves in their territory, but yet the Supreme Court has just said slavery can come into their territory. Douglas has to decide, what do I think here, right? And of course, he goes back to his idea. It was his idea, popular sovereignty, right? So he kind of comes up with a take on this, the Freeport Doctrine, that of course, if the people of a territory want that territory to be free, it should be free, right? But it should also be open to slavery. If pro-slavery forces want to move there, they want to vote to make it a slave territory, and they win, then it should be a free or a slave territory. Now, again, that is incredibly not popular with Southern Democrats. They just want a Supreme Court decision that says it doesn't matter what the state legislature says or a territorial government says. They should be able to take their slaves with them wherever they go. So Southerners are no longer okay with this idea of popular sovereignty. They feel that they should be able to take slavery whenever, wherever they want to. Douglas can't say that. If he does, then it looks like he's just backing Southern interests, not Northern interests, and Lincoln really catches him in a hard spot here. Now, in the end, throughout these debates, it highlights this divide that's happening in the North and throughout the entire country, right? Douglas is going to barely win re-election. He kind of saves himself here, right? He's still incredibly popular because he's a national figure now. And of course, Illinois doesn't want to change too much here because Douglas is a senior person in the Senate. He carries a lot of power in the Senate for the state of Illinois. So he gets reelected. And out of this, it's kind of seen that, hey, he weathered a tough battle. He's got what it takes. He's kind of the leader of the Northern Democrats now. But the flip side, curiously, is also true. Lincoln almost took out one of the most powerful Democrats in the North. He barely lost. And it really kind of establishes him on a national scene, right? People across the country followed these debates, listened to what both of these guys were saying, and a lot of Northerners thought, hey, I'm kind of with Lincoln and the Republicans. I like what they're saying. It sounds good to me. So here in this debates in the 1858 election, two stars are really kind of born here. One for the Democratic Party in Stephen Douglas, and one for the Republican Party in Abraham Lincoln. But before we kind of move on to that next moment, right, the moment that really most people are looking at here, the 1860 election, everybody knows, sort of like when Andrew Jackson lost the 1824 election, everybody knows it's the next election that really matters, right? We're just kind of in a holding pattern, so to speak, politically in this country for that next election. Well, that's kind of what's happening here in 1858. Everybody knew the 1856 election was just kind of a get-through-it election, that the next one was going to be the big one. 1860 was going to be the one that really decided what direction this country's going in. But before that happens, right, we have to kind of understand just how big of a star this guy Abraham Lincoln has become, right? He epitomizes what Northerners are about here during this period. Even though he's born in Kentucky, a slave state, he chooses not to follow that idea of opportunity, right? Kind of think about it this way. Abraham Lincoln is born the same year that the Davis family has a new member of their family, a guy by the name of Jefferson Davis. We talked about him in a couple lectures ago, right? The Davis family and Lincoln's family, they have choices to make here in 1809, 1810, when these guys, Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln, are born. What direction do you want to go in? How are you going to amass wealth? How are you going to become successful in this country? Abraham Lincoln's family decides, unlike the Davis family, to do it without slavery, right? Lincoln's going to grow up in Kentucky from a poor farming family, and eventually, when he has a rudimentary, self-educated person, he's going to move to a northern state, right? He could have moved west like the Davis brothers done, bought land out west, bought slaves, and started becoming a cotton grower, right? That he could have done exactly what the Davis family did. He chose not to. He went to the north. The Davis family went south, right? And in a lot of ways, Lincoln kind of epitomizes what a lot of Northerners think their system, their way of their American way, kind of enables people to do. Uh, Lincoln, without any real formal education, has become a very good lawyer, right? He wins a lot of cases, not all of them, but a lot of them. He gets into politics. He joins the Republican Party. And by 1858, this self educated, self made man, without relying on slavery or a rich family, is now one of the leading members of the Republican Party. So, for a lot of Republicans, or a lot of Northerners, this guy kind of represents the way they think things should work. That anybody can be president, that anybody can do well in this country as long as you work hard and you have at least a little bit of ability, right? So Lincoln, in a lot of ways, is epitomizing what's going on here, right? And he's tied himself to these ideas. Again, personally, probably an abolitionist, but publicly, he is saying, "Look, I want land out west to go to poor farmers like my family, so they can become rich farmers. And the only way they're going to be able to do that is if there's not a slave owner going out there buying all the good land and leaving the rest for everybody else." Right? He's against the spread of slavery, just like his party is. But that doesn't mean he's ready to take away the right of Southerners to own slaves. He is not officially an abolitionist at this time, right? So kind of keep that in mind. Northerners really feel they're trying to reach out to Southerners, saying we're not getting rid of slavery, we just don't want it to spread anymore. But if you're a Southerner, you say, hey, look, I have a legal right to slavery. The Supreme Court says so. I have a legal right to take my slave wherever I want. And if you can keep me from taking my slave into this area, then eventually you can take away my right to own a slave completely. So that's really kind of what's at stake here. And that's really what people understand this next election is going to be all about, right? And if you get down to it, there has to be kind of an explanation here of why Northerners are so slow to come to this position, right? Why are Northerners right? Finally, after decades of kind of ignoring this issue, why are they slowly starting to come around to the Republican position, this idea of limiting the spread of slavery? And some may say it's because they generally care about the mistreatment of African Americans as slaves in the South. And there might be some truth to that, right? Stories like Thomas Clarkson's and Benjamin Drew's and stories like Frederick Douglass's are convincing some Northerners that that's a pretty cruel institution. Really appeals to their moral sensibilities, right? Especially in an area of the country where they're talking about moral reforms all the time. But really, what's kind of fostering a lot of this, what's making people turn to somebody like a Lincoln here, is the fact that a lot of Northerners, like those gold miners that went to California, they're worried about what the threat slavery poses to their economic well-being, right? Because again, think about it like those gold miners, right? A bunch of lower middle class people leaving places like New York, leaving places like Ohio and Indiana, heading out west to find gold. Well, if you get out there and you find some rich Southerner is already there working ground with 10 or 12 slaves, that guy's going to be able to dig a lot more gold than you. And he's going to be able to take that gold from the ground and buy more places to look for more gold, and you're not going to be able to compete against him. That's kind of the fear a lot of Northerners have here in the 1850s. Again, they're not abolitionists, but they are worried that the South is starting to kind of gain economic control of places like the West, and they are afraid of what that means for them economically. The opportunity to go from being poor to being well off in this country, to being economically successful, is very much at stake for them. So here we kind of see this transition that's finally starting to take place, right? Things like Uncle Tom's Cabin is kind of made Northerners aware of the issue of slavery when they maybe didn't pay attention to it before. They were kind of confused. Well, Southerners are saying this and abolitionists are saying that, and I don't know who to believe. Well, Harry Beecher Stowe's book, because it's fiction, makes it a lot easier to understand, makes it a lot easier to kind of think about it in moral terms. And they're starting to kind of see that slavery is a threat, yeah, on a moral issue, but also on an economic issue. So again, the stakes are pretty high here in the 1850s. And as we've seen from the political results of the 1858 election, Northerners are starting to transition from being kind of non-committal, non-confrontational on the issue of slavery to becoming more and more about limiting the spread of slavery. And that's what brings us to a big moment here, right? Right before this election year kicks off in 1860, a tragic event takes place, but it's one that really kind of, again, crystallizes the feelings on both sides here. That guy we talked about in the last lecture, this man John Brown, this man that feels he's in contact with God, that God speaks to him, that he's an agent of God, right? He moved with his family and some friends out to the Kansas territory to make sure it was going to be a free territory, but they got there too late. Those pro-slavery forces had already held elections and declared Kansas to be a slave territory. Well, he's the one that decided with a few of his sons and a few of his friends to go out and attack some of these pro-slavery people, people that had supported the pro-slavery government of Kansas, and he killed 5 of those people himself. Now, he disappears in the aftermath of these killings, and he's never brought to justice in Kansas for what he's done. He disappears to Canada for a while. Well, here in October of 1859, he again feels called by God. He again feels he needs to strike a blow against slavery. He needs to convince people that slavery is what's tearing the country apart like it did in Kansas. So in October of 1859, John Brown leaves Canada and starts moving down through the north. Now, again, this guy is wanted for murder, and yet nobody's turning him in, right? He's using that Underground Railroad to kind of move around the north, talk to people, even people like Frederick Douglass, and say, hey, look, I have an idea of how to free slaves. Now, of course, everybody wants to listen to this, right? Again, he is a good speaker. He's just a very intense person. He's very captivating, right? So he commands attention, right, when he talks to you. And people like Frederick Douglass listen to him. They want to know, what's your idea? How can we free slaves, right? How can we finally end slavery? And Brown lays it out pretty simply. He's going to go down into the South, and he's going to help start a slave rebellion. And he lays out his plan. He's going to go to a place called Harper's Ferry. It's actually a manufacturing site where the federal government makes weapons for the U.S. Army. He's going to take that federal arsenal, that's where the weapons are made and stored, and he's going to hand them out to slaves. And then they're going to fight for their freedom. Now, a lot of people are kind of inspired by this. They feel like, at this point, after the Dred Scott decision, they're going to have to do something violent to actually end slavery in this country. So again, these are abolitionists talking to each other here. But it pretty soon becomes clear to everybody, especially people like Frederick Douglass, that John Brown is maybe a little crazy because this thing is not really well planned out. John Brown just thinks magically slaves are going to know that there's weapons waiting for them, and they're going to come here and get those weapons and go back home to their plantations and take their lives, right, and find their freedom. So eventually, when it becomes known to most people involved in this that this is not going to probably work very well, people like Frederick Douglass kind of back out of this plan. But John Brown won't stop. He's not deterred. He, 3 of his sons, and 19 other followers are going to go down there and carry this plan out anyways. And in late October of 1859, they do. They show up at night after the factory workers have all gone. They pound on the gates to this arsenal. The night watchman, basically a security guard, answers the gate, the pounding at the gate. They attack him. They knock him over. They unintentionally kill him, right? They kind of try to apprehend him, hit him over the head to get him to be quiet, and they hit him too hard and fracture his skull, and he dies. So they didn't intend for that to happen, but it did. But in the meantime, they start stacking up weapons at the gate, and they wait for the slaves to show up. It is certain that God will inspire people to come and grab weapons to fight for their freedom. The only problem is it never happens. John Brown and his followers just wait and wait and wait, and the only thing that happens is the next morning the factory workers come back, they see the dead guard, they see all these strangers with all these weapons piled around, and they know something bad's happened. They go and get authorities because it's a federal installation. A military captain from the United States Army is sent there by the name of Robert E. Lee. He comes with some Virginia militiamen, what we would today call the National Guard, and he arrests John Brown and his men. Now, to John Brown's credit, he could have fought, he could have made this a battle, but he chose not to, right? He wanted as little loss of life as possible. And after all, the main thing he came there to do, start a slave rebellion, never materialized. So in the end, he surrenders with his followers. And because everybody knows he's the guy that killed people in Kansas, Southerners really want him to be punished this time. Now, they can't prove, there's no witnesses that can prove he was the person that killed people in Kansas, but they can prove he was there trying to start a slave rebellion in Virginia. So he is put on trial for this and quickly found guilty there in Virginia of trying to incite a slave rebellion and being the leader of this attack that killed the security guard. Before he's sentenced to death, he's gonna be hung, right? He's gonna be hung by a rope and asphyxiated, his neck broken. But before that sentence is carried out, John Brown is allowed to speak, right? To kind of have final words, if you will. And his final words were pretty telling here, right? Again, he kind of summed up this divide that's happened in the country. And in essence, to kind of paraphrase him, John Brown says this. He kind of says, I find it's interesting that I'm being executed here for carrying out this attack on this arsenal. He says, I understand what I did was wrong. I understand that somebody died and I need to be punished. He says, but what I find interesting here is I'm going to be killed because a security guard was killed while I was trying to start a slave rebellion. But yet, if I had come down here with my followers to crush a slave rebellion and had killed enslaved people, I would have been treated as a hero by Southerners. And that's powerful if you stop and think about it, right? Because he killed a white person, he's a criminal, a terrorist, right? But if he had gone and killed black people that were fighting for their freedom, he would have been hailed a hero, especially by Southerners. So again, Brown kind of brings out this hypocrisy that's developed in the United States. He points out clearly that we have some really messed up ideas about what's right and wrong in this country. It's okay to kill one person because of the color of their skin, but not another, right? And Brown is really kind of bringing this home. Now, in the end, he is going to be executed. He's going to be killed. A couple of his followers that killed the security guard are going to be killed as well. The rest are going to be in prison. But it really does divide the nation, right? A lot of Northerners say, look, this is what we thought was going to happen, right? These problems are just getting worse. It's because slavery exists that these things are happening. And Southerners are saying, finally, we got some revenge on one of these Northerners that is attacking us. But I feel that Southerners fear that Northerners are just going to keep attacking them over the issue of slavery. So again, you kind of see how that issue is just wrapped up in everything that's happening here. You can't really look at any problem between the North and the South without seeing slavery in the background, either in the economics of things, the morality of things, or in the politics of things. And that's what brings us to this big moment, the election of 1860, right? Again, after John Brown's raid, Southerners say, hey, look, we have to have control of the government. We know we're not going to have control of the House. We know we're probably not going to have control of the Senate anymore. We have to have the presidency, or else we have no way to protect ourselves and our institutions, right? Protect slavery. Northerners, on the other hand, are saying it's about time we, as the larger part of the country, have the say and have somebody that's going to look out for our interests, that are going to do the things that we want to do. So here in the election of 1860, we see a big moment, right? And we also see some of these problems. Once again, as they have in the past 2 or 3 election cycles, the Democrats have some real problems finding a candidate, right? That's been going back to the 1840s now, right? Northern Democrats like their guy, Stephen Douglas. They think he's somebody that can work with the South. They can kind of bridge over these differences and keep things going. Southerners, on the other hand, just see him as a Northerner. Yeah, he's kind of sometimes proposed things that work for them, but most of the time it was pretty weak what he was offering the South. Southerners want a Southerner. So when it comes time to choose a candidate, the Democratic Party meets kind of in the middle in Charleston, South Carolina, right? They try to find somebody that'll appeal to both sides. But Southerners say, no, we won't choose a Northerner to be our candidate. It has to be a Southerner. Northerners say there's no way a Southern Democrat is going to win right now. There's nobody popular like an Andrew Jackson anymore, like a Zachary Taylor anymore, right? It's got to be a Northerner. Otherwise, the Republicans are going to win the election. So in the end, the Democratic Party actually does split. Northerners go to Baltimore, Maryland, and there they hold a convention where they choose Stephen Douglas. Southerners, on the other hand, choose their candidate, a guy that looks remarkably like Matthew Perry from Friends. That's him in the lower right-hand corner, John Breckinridge. He's from Kentucky. He's an unabashed supporter of slavery. He's a slave owner. He wants to extend slavery all throughout the country, even into the North, even into states where it says no slavery. He wants to take more territory, especially in the Caribbean, where there's already slavery in existence, and expand the United States in that area. So what we kind of see, the Democratic Party kind of falls apart here. Northern Democrats want somebody that represents them. Southern Democrats want somebody that represents them. Now, curiously, there is a remnant of the Democratic Party that kind of meets in the middle, right? A person by the name of John Bell is going to run as what we today call a third party, right? So the Democratic Party kind of splits into North and South Democrats, and then a remainder kind of meet with this guy John Bell from Tennessee, runs on a constitutional party, where they say, hey, we're just going to kind of we're going to try to keep both sides together here. We're going to run a candidate that says, I'll do whatever the Constitution says. So I'll enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, but I'll also say if a state's free, it's free, and there's no slavery there. So there are still Americans trying to find that middle ground, right? There are some Americans, even some Southerners, that are trying to say, look, what'll make everybody happy, right? But as we'll see, that's harder and harder to do. Now, that's the problems for the Democratic Party. For the Republican Party, they don't have any problems. They already have a candidate that they know and that they like and that they think represents them. That's Abraham Lincoln. He easily wins the Republican convention in 1860 and becomes their national candidate for president. And he kind of sticks with the things that Northerners have been sticking with for a long time. More land out west, really cheap, so people can move out west and become farmers, become self-made men. Internal improvements like railroads and canals, loans to businesses from the federal government to help stimulate the economy, a protective tariff to keep out cheap competition from Europe and other places. But the one thing the Republican Party has added to all of this that a lot of Northerners are now kind of in agreement on is we're not getting rid of slavery, but there can't be any more slave states. We don't want this problem to get worse, to get bigger. Northerners have finally come to the conclusion that slavery can't expand anymore, or at least Republican Northerners have come to that conclusion. So here in 1860, again, you don't have just 2 people running for president, you've got 4. You've got Lincoln for the Republicans, you've got Stephen Douglas for Northern Democrats, John Breckinridge for Southern Democrats, and this guy, John Bell, kind of trying to pick up in the middle, right? Trying to convince people in places like Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, right? Trying to find a middle ground here. Say we're going to protect the Constitution. We'll enforce laws like the Fugitive Slave Act. Make people in the North and South happy. Now, in the end, it's a pretty foregone conclusion what's going to happen here, right? In the end, the Republican Party, which is dominating a lot of the northern state legislatures now, handily wins northern states. But something kind of curious does happen here, right? In the electoral vote, Lincoln doesn't get a huge majority of the vote. He only gets 40%, which means 6 out of 10 American voters chose somebody other than Lincoln, right? So Lincoln was not an overwhelming popular favorite here. He was favored just by Northerners. As a matter of fact, his name wasn't even allowed on the ballots of most southern states. Especially in the deep state, they made it illegal to vote for the Republican candidate in places like North Carolina, Georgia, and Mississippi, right? So it's not surprising that Lincoln didn't get a lot of votes in the South, right? It's not actually surprising that he didn't get as many votes as he probably could have. A lot of Southerners probably would have voted for him. Not a majority, but quite a few probably would have voted for him, especially in places like Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee. But in the end, those three states, Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, go with that moderate candidate, right? John Bell. Southerners, of course, go with their guy, John Breckinridge. He sweeps the South, easily winning every southern slave state. Stephen Douglas can't even win his home state of Illinois because, well, that's where Abraham Lincoln's from, too. So Lincoln wins Illinois. The best Stephen Douglas can do is he gets a few votes in New Jersey, he gets some votes in Missouri, and he gets a few electoral votes. So how does Lincoln win then, right? The Southern Democrat Breckinridge wins a lot of states. Lincoln wins a lot of states. Lincoln gets a lot of votes. So does Breckinridge. So does Douglas, right? If you stop and look at it, Douglas gets 1.3 million votes, right? Lincoln gets 1.8 million. Breckinridge and Bell get about another 1.3 million. So how does Lincoln end up becoming president of the United States? Well, by a simple factor of this. It doesn't matter what Southerners want anymore. The North is in the driver's seat. There's so many Northerners, especially because of the population growth and immigration to this country. Again, as we mentioned in earlier lectures, most immigration's happening in the North. The population of the North is huge now. Lincoln may only barely win places like New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, 53-47, right? 53% of the vote for him, 47% vote for somebody else like Stephen Douglas. But that's all he has to do, right? Because we don't choose our presidents based on popular vote, we choose them based on the Electoral College. So if all three candidates, Bell, Breckinridge, and Douglas, had decided to combine their votes, they would have had substantially more popular votes than Lincoln. But because they're regional votes, Bell in Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, Breckinridge in the South, and Douglas in the northern states, it wouldn't have changed the outcome one bit because Lincoln wins all the states that he wins no matter what. He's got those 180 electoral votes no matter what happens. So in the end, Lincoln is going to win this election regardless of what anybody else thinks or wants. There is no other outcome to this election now. Which brings us to an incredibly important moment. This is not lost on people, especially Southerners. In November of 1860, before the election results are even final, it has become clear that every northern state is going to vote for Abraham Lincoln, and that because of that, because they have so many more electoral votes in the North than in the South, Lincoln is going to win. So the state of South Carolina, that's always been on the forefront of kind of defending slavery and defending Southern interests since John Calhoun in the 1820s, they decide to hold a special convention. And there, in a very close vote of 169-0, so it's unanimous, they decide to secede. Remember, they tried it under Jackson, but it didn't go well. They threatened it several other times. This time, they actually vote to do it. And then they start asking other Southerners to join them. By January of 1861, Lincoln isn't even in office yet. The Electoral College has just declared him the winner, and he is not even officially president yet. And other states hold their own conventions and decide, yeah, we're going to leave too. Pretty soon, there are 7 states in this new thing called the Confederacy. By February of 1861, Lincoln is still not president. He won't be made president until March of 1861. These states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, all decide to leave the United States and form their own country called the Confederate States of America. When news of the creation of this new country, this Southern country, built for Southerners by Southerners, goes out amongst the newspapers of the South, one reporter said, "People are wild. You might as well attempt to control a tornado as attempt to stop them," right? That people are just thrilled in the South that now they have a government that'll look out for them, that they don't have to listen to Northerners. Because that's an important moment, right? If you stop and think about this. Even though Lincoln hasn't officially said he's against slavery, right? He just said we want to limit the spread of slavery. For Southerners, that means the North is in charge, though, right? They control the House, they control the Senate, and now they'll control the presidency. They can now start passing laws that say Southerners can't take their slaves to places like California, to territories like New Mexico or Arizona. And once they limit all that, then places like Kansas, Arizona, New Mexico will become free states, and eventually there'll be so many free states that they'll be able to pass an amendment to the Constitution that makes slavery illegal. The only answer to that for most slave-owning Southerners is to create their own country that can defend the institution of slavery, that can keep it around for them. That's what they've done here in January and February of 1861. That's what's at stake here, right? So how do they justify this, right, Southerners, that they're going to create their own country so they can protect slavery? Well, some of them argued they had a constitutional right. They said, look, we joined voluntarily into the Union. When we ratified it, we can unratify it, right? One Florida slaveholder kind of said it this way: if Florida stayed in the Union, we'll be deprived of that right for which our forefathers fought in battles of the Revolution. Now, most people would have said, well, we were fighting for our independence from Great Britain, but that's not what this Florida slaveholder means, right? Again, go back to Lord Dunmore's proclamation during the Revolution. A lot of Southerners became patriots because they were afraid the British government would take away their slaves, right? And that's what they're kind of saying again. If the Republicans control the government, they will get rid of slavery. If not overnight, down the road, it will be gone, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. And the new president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, right? He's elected as the first president of the Confederacy in February of 1861. He kind of said, look, the reason for this secession, the reason we have to create our own country is the high and solemn motive of defending and protecting the rights which our fathers bequeathed to us. So a lot of Southerners say, hey, look, we have a right to have a country of our own that listens to us, that protects us and our interests. But they won't come out and say what it is that those rights are. What rights are they under that nobody else is threatened of losing, right? Well, when we get down to it, what they're really talking about, these coded messages, is their right to own slaves. That's really it, right? Americans North and South pay the same taxes. Americans North and South make money the same way. They use the same currency. They have the same legal system. Everything is the same. What Southerners want is the right to own slaves, the right to take those slaves wherever they want to, and of course, to make sure that that is never stopped by a federal government. One other Southerner kind of summed it up a little more clearly here, right? They said we're either slaves in the Union or freemen out of it, right? If we stay in the Union with Republicans in charge, they'll be able to do whatever they want, and we can't do anything to stop it. But if we start our own country, then we can do what we want. We can protect slavery, institutionalize it, and keep it for as long as we want it. So what's going on here, right? In the aftermath of the election of 1860, why have we kind of broken down suddenly when we've been able to kind of get past these moments over and over again before this? Well, the simple fact here is Southerners just don't trust Northerners anymore, right? They see Northerners, even though most Northerners aren't abolitionists, as being abolitionists because that message has been floating around for 20 years now in the North, right? dirty if you really kind of stop and think about it, since William Lloyd Garrison started his newspaper in the 1830s. And of course, on the flip side, right, some Northerners are saying, hey, wait a minute. Just because you don't trust us doesn't mean you can't leave, right? It doesn't mean you can leave. In the end, secession's unconstitutional. The Constitution doesn't say we the states, it says we the people. Well, we the people spoke. Under the system we have, we had an election. Nobody's claiming that Lincoln cheated in the election. If anything, he was cheated against by not allowing people to vote for him in certain states, and yet he's still president. Just because you lost an election, you can't pack up your toys and go home. So in the end, even the president of the United States at the time, James Buchanan, this guy that's done a remarkable job of not doing anything while president, even says, look, once this federal union falls apart, it becomes a rope of sand. Our 30 states will become themselves as many petty, jarring, hostile republics, right? He's kind of saying, look, if the South can pick up and leave, why can't California? Why can't the Northeast? Why can't the Great Lakes region? Why can't the Midwest, right? Why can't they all become their own little countries? Because if one state can do something, every state can do something. So here in 1860, there's a lot on the table. Southerners want to defend their institution of slavery. Northerners want to defend the institution of a national government, right? The idea that you have to kind of live with what the federal government does, even if you don't like it sometimes. And I think Cincinnati newspaper kind of sums it up pretty well, right? For a lot of Northerners, right? Even if you weren't somebody who really cared about the issue of slavery, you could care about this, right? That the doctrine of secession is anarchy. If any minority has the right to break up, and they mean political minority, has the right to break up the government at its pleasure because they have not had their way, there's an end of all government. So pretty quickly, a lot of Northerners, even ones that didn't vote for Lincoln, are saying, hey, wait a minute, the South's going too far here. You can't just walk away from us, right? Just because you lost an election. You have to stick with it, even if you don't like it. So the President of the United States, or the President-elect of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, he has to be extremely careful here. He's got a lot of Northerners on his side, but if he turns around and says, yeah, I'm here to destroy slavery, it's going to make Southerners be able to say, see, I told you, and it's going to make a lot of Northerners uncomfortable, right? So what he has to kind of do is try to find a way to thread the needle here, right? He's got to find a way to keep both Southerners and Northerners on board. But he has a huge problem. As the Confederacy is being created, a lot of Southerners, remember, a lot of Southerners that are slave owners, one of the ways they prove they're good leaders is going into government, going into the military. Well, they're starting to abandon the federal government now. They're joining the Confederacy, going back to their home states. So Lincoln has to find people to fill all these positions so the government can still function. And of course, federal authorities in the South are being challenged, right? Southerners are saying, hey, we're not part of the federal United States anymore. We're part of the Confederate States. We don't recognize your authority. You need to get out of here. Close up your post office. Close up your military fort. Get out. And on top of that, Lincoln has to make sure that he doesn't offend more states. When the Confederacy is created, those first 7 states, there's a lot of slave states. Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Maryland, Missouri. They haven't taken a stance yet, right? They haven't joined the Confederacy. They're still part of the United States. So Lincoln takes the most obvious choice, right? He goes with what he knows will appeal to the most people, even in the South, and that's preserve the Union. He kind of picks up on this message that others are talking about, that it's not fair for the South to just say, we don't like the results of an election, so we're going to quit the country. He says, no, we have to hold our country together, otherwise we don't have a country. So that brings us to this moment, right? When Lincoln kind of says, hey, look, we're trying to hold this country together, that he's also de-emphasizing the issue of slavery, just like a lot of Southerners are, trying to say, hey, look, I'm not here to get rid of slavery. I'm not here to limit slavery. I'm here to make sure that this country functions as one country, not 2 countries, or 3, or 12, or 33, whatever it might be. And that's what brings us to kind of this moment that tips the scales, so to speak, right? And we'll kind of look at this as we move through this. But by April of 1861, now Lincoln is officially president of the United States. He's taken the oath of office in March of 1861, and he's trying to kind of convince Southerners to give up on the Confederacy, rejoin the Union, and just kind of walk past everything. As a matter of fact, Lincoln has even said he would support a thing called the Crittenden Amendment, right? John Crittenden from Kentucky had floated an idea of a constitutional amendment saying that slavery was legal in the states that already had it, right? So basically, even Lincoln is saying, look, we're not getting rid of slavery here. We just want to keep it from growing. We don't want to lose the country over this. And that's not good enough for Southerners. At this point, they feel like, well, you can add an amendment, you can take that amendment away eventually. They just don't trust the North, right? So here in April of 1861, some Southerners, again, in kind of the radical parts of the South, especially South Carolina, decide it's time for push to come to shove, right? They've got to convince Northerners, the federal government, that this Confederacy is real. And they choose to kind of make a demonstration of this in South Carolina, in the city of Charleston, kind of the center of resistance in South Carolina, right? This big coastal city that's an important port city for Southerners. Well, the reason they're going to make this their symbol, if you will, right? Their moment of announcement that they're not going to set federal authority anymore, is because there's a federal fort sitting in the middle of Charleston Harbor. It would really make it impossible for Southerners to import or export anything out of South Carolina with this federal fort there. So in April of 1861, this new Confederacy that South Carolina is a part of sends word to the federal commander at Fort Sumter that you need to leave the fort, that the Confederacy is going to take it over. Well, the commander of the fort, the federal colonel that's in charge, he's been told, you cannot give up this fort. You have to hold on to it. We're going to try and pretend like the Confederacy doesn't exist, and hopefully Southerners will just give up on it. So when Anderson is asked to, his rank is major and his name's Anderson, right? So when Major Anderson is asked by the Confederates, are you ready to surrender your fort? He says, look, I can't. I'm under orders from the President of the United States to hold on to it. So the Confederates say, you've got 24 hours. If you don't surrender, we'll begin bombarding you until you do surrender. And when Anderson doesn't surrender his fort on April 12th, they begin bombarding it. For 24 hours, Southerners shell this fort. They do a lot of damage, but thankfully no human being is killed. A couple horses are injured, one is killed, but no human beings are killed yet. We could still walk back from this. But in the end, Anderson decides, look, there's no way I can withstand days of this. There's no way anybody's going to come here to bring us supplies and more food. We might as well just surrender and get it over with. So he surrenders the fort. And now Lincoln is forced to declare war, right? The state of South Carolina is in open rebellion to the federal government. Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops to put down this rebellion of the Confederacy. And now states are going to have to decide, what side are you on? We know 7 states have already said we're part of the Confederacy, but what about the rest of them? What's Virginia going to do? What's Pennsylvania and New York going to do? Well, what we find is a lot of northern states say, yeah, we have to put down this rebellion. Southerners just fired on the United States. We have to do something about this. A lot of other southern states, especially southern slave states, say, hey, wait a minute, we don't like this. We don't want to have to go to war with fellow Southerners. So in the end, Lincoln's having a hard time here, right? Border states are kind of these middle ground states that don't rely on slavery as crucially for their economy as places like Georgia and Texas do. They're still going to go with the Confederacy, right? North Carolina is a perfect example of this. One North Carolinian said the division must be made on the line of slavery. The South must go with the South. Blood is thicker than water. That in the end, a lot of southern states said, look, if we support the Union over the Confederacy, that means eventually slavery will be gone. So they join the Confederacy. By April through June of 1861, four more states have joined the Confederacy: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Places like Missouri and Kentucky end up with two different governments, one for the Union, one staying with the United States, the other wanting to join the Confederacy. So there's going to be civil wars within the Civil War here. The state of Maryland, also a slave state, but very tied to the North economically, actually votes to join the Confederacy, but troops are sent in from neighboring Pennsylvania to take control of the state and force it to stay in the Union. So this is a very wild time. This country really is kind of disintegrating, at least in the border areas between the North and the South. It's hard to decide who's in charge, who's got control of anything. And just to show you how divided it is, the state of Virginia actually falls apart as well. When Virginia decides to join the Confederacy, part of Virginia, what we now call West Virginia, says, no, if you're going to secede from the Union, we're going to secede from Virginia and rejoin the Union. So there's a lot going on here, right? This is a messy situation. Yes, it's broken on geographical lines, but as you can see in places like Missouri and Kentucky, sometimes that geography doesn't really help you. You're not sure who's on what side. To kind of point this out in other terms, right? More than a third of a million Southerners are going to fight for the Union. Several thousand people, tens of thousands, if you think about it in states that stay officially with the Union, from places like Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, are actually going to fight for the Confederacy. So this truly is an American war. Everybody fighting here, everybody dying here is going to be an American. It is going to tear this nation apart. It is one of the most devastating conflicts we have ever fought in our history. Again, about 1 million Americans are going to die one way or another from this war. It is how huge and tragic it really is. And you can also see something else here, right? Uh, this map kind of lays out what are the states of the Confederacy as they kind of join, right? The ones with the lighter hash marks, hash lines on the in the lower south, those are the ones that originally joined the Confederacy. The next four, places like Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, those are the ones that joined the Confederacy after Fort Sumter, after Confederates fire on federal troops. But what's curious here is that places like Missouri, Kentucky, this portion, the new eventual new state of West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, those are all slave states as well, or slave territories as well. But they won't join the Confederacy. So this is where it gets a little confusing. A lot of people are going to say, well, if it was really about slavery, wouldn't all of those slave states left? Well, true. And actually, that's kind of what happens. Again, Missouri, part of it is trying to leave and join the Confederacy. Same in Kentucky. Now in West Virginia, they're actually doing the opposite, but that's because there's almost no slaves in West Virginia, right? It's just a bunch of small white farmers in very poor, impoverished areas. The last thing they want is some rich Southerner to come in with a bunch of slaves and take all the good land and leave them with nothing, right? So they're very anti-slavery in some ways in West Virginia. In Maryland, they try to join the Confederacy, but they fail because neighboring states like New Jersey and Pennsylvania helps the federal cause send troops in to keep control of that territory. Delaware is going to start moving to ending slavery here in the Civil War. So you kind of see actually it does play out kind of the way you would think, right? Another explanation for what's going on here is that states like Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, their economies are tied into the North. In the end, they're northern states that rely on that market economy more than slavery. Most Southerners or most slave owners in Missouri don't really grow a lot of cotton. Most of the population in Missouri doesn't own slaves. Same in Kentucky, same in Maryland. So in the end, those states really aren't as Southern as you might think, even though slavery is legal there. So this gets messy. It makes it hard to kind of always understand what's going on. But in the end, you can see something from this map. This thing called the Confederacy does exist. It has 11 states. It's big. And that is something to kind of keep in mind. Those 11 states make up about 40% of the country right now, right? Of what was the United States. So this thing is huge. And that means it's going to be a tough fight to take this thing over, right? So let's kind of wrap this up a little bit by looking at some of the issues the North and the South have here. Right. What are some of the strengths that they both have? What are some of the weaknesses? What are some of the things they're going to have to do to actually win this conflict that they now find themselves in? So let's start by doing this. Let's kind of keep in mind just how huge this conflict is going to be, this thing called the American Civil War. Now, remember, they don't know how big it's going to be. Many people in the very beginning, especially in the days after Fort Sumter, think that this is going to be over in a matter of weeks, maybe months, right? Most a year. Most people feel by December of 1861, this war will be over one way or the other. But just the opposite is going to happen. It's going to drag on and drag on. Both sides are going to commit and dig down deep into what's going on here, right? So let's take a look at this and just kind of make sure we're familiar with just how huge this conflict is in just staggering numbers that come out of it, right? First and foremost, this war is going to be across the continent. There's going to be fighting out in California between pro-slave, pro-Confederate, and pro-Union forces. Places like Visalia are going to try and support the Confederacy. Places like San Jose and San Francisco are going to support the Union effort and raise troops and raise money for it. So this is going to be a huge thing. It's going to span across the continent, and it's going to have more than 10,000 battles within it, right? Most of those are going to be in the eastern part of the country, east of the Mississippi. And of those battles, almost all of them are going to be on the east of the Appalachians, around kind of the eastern seaboard, if you will. But still, 10,000 military engagements is a huge number. And of course, with so many battles being fought, the death toll is going to be staggering as well. More than a third of a million Northerners, soldiers, are going to die. About 100,000 are going to die directly in battle from their wounds. Another 250, a quarter of a million soldiers, are going to be killed from diseases as they march around the country, right? The medicine is still in its infancy here. They don't understand germs. They don't understand good hygiene particularly well. They're not organized for this kind of stuff. That it'll happen during the war, but it'll take them a long time to start figuring these things out. So the death toll from diseases are going to be just staggering, right? A quarter of a million people just from the north in this. So about a third of a million Northerners are going to die in this war, fighting it directly in uniform. For the South, they're going to lose about a quarter of a million, about 100,000, so very comparable in battle casualties, but about 160,000 from disease. The Southern armies are going to be smaller, so it makes sense that they'll have fewer. And then look at the number of people that are wounded. A quarter of a million wounded for the North, about 200,000 for the South. So on top of all of this death, right, of 600,000 dead, you have another 500,000 that are going to be severely wounded, usually losing legs or arms in this battle, or having permanent lung damage, concussive damage, what we would today call post-traumatic stress, right? All of these things are going to happen. On top of this, we don't even know how many civilians get caught in the crossfire when these armies fight each other, or more realistically, how many are going to die from starvation and diseases when these armies move through their areas and devastate their counties and their communities, right? So we don't even know. It could be well over a million Americans could have died in this conflict. 1 out of 30 Americans could be dead from this thing called the Civil War. We just don't know. So here, this is a big thing, right? And again, a lot of Americans think that it's not going to be like that it's not going to be that devastating. One of the reasons is kind of encapsulated here in this visual, right? I've kind of taken the liberty of taking facts and figures from other sources and kind of compiling them here into this chart. And if you stop and look at this, right, it seems like this war is going to be an overwhelming victory for the North very, very quickly, right? The North has more people, 22 million people versus 9 million for the South. Of those 9 million for the South, 4 million are slaves, right? So there's only 5 million whites to fight for the South against 22 million whites in the North. Industrial capacity. 9 out of 10 factories in the country is located in the North. 7 out of 10 railroad miles of track are located in the North. So again, the North is integrated, it's modernized, it's industrialized, much more than the South. Weapon production, something critical in a war. 97% of all weapons production is in the North, right? That's where the factories are. That's where they make the guns, the cannons, the ships, right? That's where it all takes place. The South has very little of all of that. So if you're somebody that supports the Union, supports the federal government here, you think, hey, we're going to win this thing easy, hands down. If you're a Southerner, this should scare you, right? But yet Southerners are going to be saying, no, 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 we can win this. That 9 million population, sure, 4 million are slaves, but that means those 4 million slaves can keep working, producing food, producing cotton, working in factories if we need them to. We've got labor, and we can send 5 million people to go fight. The North can't do that. They've got to send people into the factories. They have to send people to work on the railroads. They have to send people to work on guns. They are going to need all 22 million people to do all that. A railroad track, also not as overwhelming an advantage as you would think for the North. Most of that railroad track, as I pointed out in previous lectures, goes east to west, not north to south. So it'll be easy for the Union to kind of marshal its resources, but it's going to be hard to bring those armies, the munitions, right, down into the South. They're going to have to build new railroads. The South's railroads are there and ready to go, right? Or most likely, use rivers. They're big, wide rivers all throughout the South, easy transportation networks. So if you stop and think about it that way, the South really does kind of have a lot of advantages on its own. Now, of course, the one thing, weapon production, you would think would be the big game changer here, it also isn't as big a game changer. True, the North's going to be able to make its weapons, but the South could build factories, right? They can build factories. They can use their slave labor to start making weapons. So that's a possibility. But more useful, actually, just go out and purchase them from other places. Buy them from France, buy them from Britain, buy them from Germany, whoever, and import your weapons. Again, some of the most wealthy people in the United States are Southern slave owners. These big plantation owners like Jefferson Davis have a lot of money. They have a lot of credit. They grow a lot of cotton. They can use that to buy whatever the Confederacy needs. So in the end, both sides think, hey, we've got a lot going for us. We should be able to win this war pretty quickly and pretty easily. They kind of understand that these facts and figures aren't as overwhelming as today we might think they are, right? Both sides think they really have a chance here. So let's turn to the Confederacy really quick, right? What do they got going on for them? Well, what issues do they have to deal with here? Now, what's kind of interesting is they can choose a leader pretty quickly, right? Once the Confederacy was created, most Southerners agreed Jefferson Davis should be our guy. He's got experience in government, in national government. He was the Secretary of War in the Pierce administration. He was in battle in the war with Mexico. He knows how to win wars. Let's make him our guy. And when he comes into office, he's got to figure out how to bring this thing together, this thing called the Confederacy. Remember, 75% of Southerners, white Southerners, don't own slaves. So he's got to de-emphasize slavery. He can't be telling a bunch of poor white Southerners, hey, you need to fight for me so that I can own slaves, right? That's not going to work really well. So what he has to do is say, hey, look, we're fighting to make sure that people like you can get rich. Now, how are you going to get rich? By owning slaves, right? That's how their system works. But Jefferson Davis is going to be able to say, no, 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 we're fighting for our liberty. The government's coming to take things away from us. He never defines what it is that the federal government's trying to take away, what rights are being deprived of Southerners, right? There aren't any. The only thing is the threat of abolition, the threat of losing slavery, right? That's what it's all about. Now, what makes this easier for Davis, right, where he can kind of leave it very ambiguous like this, is the fact that after Fort Sumter, when Lincoln calls for troops to be raised to put down this rebellion, he can tell a bunch of poor white Southerners, hey, you're fighting for your house. The Northerners are going to come down here to crush this rebellion, and they're going to stomp over your fields. They're going to shoot you. They're going to attack you just like they're going to attack me. Fight for your home. Fight for your state. Fight for your people, right? So that's the way that people like Davis are going to kind of emphasize things, right? Another thing that he's going to do, or it's going to work out to a kind of a Southern advantage, is the longer this war goes on, the less clear what it is about, right? At the very beginning, everybody really knows that it's about slavery. But as this thing goes on longer and longer, people like Davis can say, hey, we're just fighting to exist here. We've been fighting for years. You don't want to give up on that. You don't want those dead people that you know that have died in this war to have died for nothing, do you? You want to win, don't you? So that's going to make it possible for him to kind of keep appealing to people to keep fighting when in the end there really isn't a whole lot in it for them. And then of course comes something else. That all of this idea that the Southerners are going to kind of rebrand this war, especially after they lose, into this idea that they were fighting for liberty, for self-government, for their rights, if you will. It's going to be called the myth of the lost cause because people like Davis say, well, we're not really just fighting for slavery here. We're fighting for other things as well, for our right to determine for ourselves how our states are run, right? We didn't agree with this federal government for a long time. It's not really about slavery. But what kind of really makes this a myth is the fact that when the Confederacy is created, as states join the Confederacy, every one of their state constitutions says slavery is legal in our state. They never said that before, right? They're saying it now when they're members of the Confederacy. So there are some big changes happening here, right? They're kind of rebranding themselves on the fly here, these Confederacy. But in the end, they really are fighting to own slaves, right? That's really what this is all about. All this other stuff just becomes kind of this myth that they were fighting for something else, that they were fighting for life and liberty and homes, when in reality it was really about defending the institution of slavery because that's the only thing that was on the line here. Now, looking at some other issues here, right? For the North, you would think that, hey, this is going to be a hands down a win. You've got the biggest economy right now. You've got a lot of people. You've got the factories. You have the railroads. You have a national government. You can raise money, things that the Confederacy can't do. It's got to learn how to do. So you have a lot of advantages. The Confederacy, on the other hand, seems kind of weak. Sure, they can grow a lot of food, they can grow cotton, but it's going to be hard for them to export all of that stuff. By the 1863, the Confederate Army is going to be running out of things like anesthetics, right, to put people out, anesthesia, to knock soldiers out while they're amputating arms and legs. So most Southern soldiers are going to be awake while their arms are being cut off, right? So this is showing you just how much the North has going for it and the South doesn't, and yet it's going to be a 4-year long war, right? It's not going to be over very quickly. So what's parted to explain that? Well, some historians have kind of pointed out that the Confederacy kind of died a democracy. When the Confederacy is created, the states see this as their opportunity to make sure they're in charge of their national government. They kind of like what Patrick Henry had been talking about back in the Constitutional Convention in the 1780s, right? He kind of said, look, power should be in the states. Well, that's what the Confederacy does. They say that states are kind of not sovereign, but they do have a lot of power. The federal government for the Confederacy doesn't have a lot of power. And that because of that, that federal government for the Confederate government can't actually force a lot of states to do things, to raise money, to raise troops, to send those troops a long ways away. There's going to be some troops from Texas marching into Virginia to help defend Virginia, but not many. There's not going to be very many Virginia troops going out west to protect places like Mississippi and Tennessee, right? So it's going to be very hard for the Confederacy to kind of pull all of this together. On the flip side, the North, again, seems to have everything it needs to win this war. But there are some issues here. Out of 22 million people in the North, 20% of them, about 4 million, weren't born in the United States. They're from places like Germany and Ireland. And they don't feel that this is their fight. They're not going to be willing to go and fight. As a matter of fact, sometimes they're going to have to be forced. When the North is really short on manpower in the middle of the war by the 1862, 1863, they're going to start a draft. And a lot of people from Ireland are going to say, I'm not going to go fight in this war for you. There are riots against the draft in New York City in 1863. The U.S. Navy is forced to fire on New York to put down these riots. So the North has some issues too, right? And Southerners are going to be looking at a possible help, a possible aid here, right? to kind of balance out the power differential between the North and the South. Southerners understand that one of the ways to easily win this war is to get European help, to get Europeans on their side, get Britain, get France to give them money, give them supplies, so that they can win this war against the North. A lot of Southerners think that's going to be pretty easy. Countries like Britain buy a lot of Southern cotton. All Southerners have to do is threaten to not sell that cotton anymore, and the British government will go ahead and give them whatever they want. Now, there is like a kernel of truth there, right? A lot of European governments would actually kind of like to see the United States split into two because it lessens them in the United States' power. Uh, Countries like Britain and France were already worried about how powerful the American economy was becoming and how much that could turn into military power in a very quick way. Some of that's going to be borne out during the Civil War. But Southerners kind of saw a hope there, right? They kind of got kind of a positive reception from members of the British government and the French government saying, yeah, we wouldn't mind helping you out. You just kind of have to prove you can win here, right? Sort of like in the American Revolution. One side, however, wasn't on that, and that is the base population of Europe. Most British citizens, especially those working in the factories, identified with the North. They didn't like the idea of slave labor being used to dislocate factory workers. They saw that that is inherently unfair. The Southerners were taking advantage of other human beings for their own personal gain. Another problem that the South's going to have is that they had grown so much cotton in the last few years that there was a glut of cotton on the market. So when they threatened to boycott Britain or France, unless Britain and France does what it wants, Britain and France could say, no, we got plenty of cotton. Right? And then the other factor is that the United States still has a navy, the Confederacy doesn't. So the United States could use the U.S. Navy to block off the South from Europe, making it harder to get guns, to ship cotton, to pay for those guns out as well. So there is a lot going on here. And what I'm trying to point out is kind of summed up well in this picture in the right-hand corner here. That is a picture of Abraham Lincoln in 1861 as he becomes president of the United States. What that statue, where that statue is the interesting thing about it. Not that there's a statue to Abraham Lincoln, but that it's in Manchester, England. Manchester is one of these industrial cities in England, and this money was raised by factory workers during the war to kind of tell the British government whose side they were on, that they wanted to support the United States against the Confederacy. Now, that's not going to always hold true. The Confederacy will be able to buy some ships, buy weapons from Great Britain, but by and large, Britain and the rest of Europe stays neutral in this war, which means the Confederacy is going to have a harder time winning, and it makes it a little easier for the North. But in the end, both sides still are going to have to fight it out to see who's going to win here. So let's turn really quick to the strategy involved here, right? How are these two sides going to pull this off? And one thing to kind of keep in mind, we know how this war plays out, but they don't. And in the end, you got to kind of keep in mind, it's not inevitable that the Union's going to win. Again, a lot of the things say it should, but it also said that Britain should have won the American Revolution pretty easily if you stop and think about it. So if you're the South, if you're the Confederacy, you can look back at the American Revolution and say, hey, look, American colonists fought the most powerful country in the world. It had a lot of money, had a lot of military power, but they still survived, right? Well, Confederates can say the same thing. We're up against a powerful enemy. It's got a lot of industrial might. It has a lot of wealth, but we have some wealth here. We have some advantages here. We could also win this as well, right? That really kind of, if you stop and think about it, the South doesn't have to win this war. Just like the American colonists didn't have to invade Britain to get their independence. All they've got to do is outlast their opponent. The South just has to hang on and tire the North out, just like American colonists had to just outlast the British government. And that's a lot easier if you stop and think about it that way. And what kind of comes out of this, out of the first couple battles after Fort Sumter and the firing on Fort Sumter, they don't go well for the North. But Northerners don't give up very quickly. A lot of Southerners thought, hey, we win the first couple of battles, Northerners will give in and this will be all over. But a New York newspaper kind of summed it up this way. It's not characteristics of Americans to sit down despondently after a defeat. Let us go to work then with a will. So even after a first couple early losses, a lot of Northerners said, we got too much on the line, keep going, keep fighting. Richmond newspaper, Richmond, Virginia, the new capital of the Confederacy in 1861, right? They kind of were inspired by these early victories, right? For a lot of Confederates, they thought, hey, victory is just a little bit farther away. We just a couple more victories and this is all over, right? So a Richmond newspaper in an editorial said it this way: the breakdown of the Yankee race, right? These Northerners, their unfitness for empire forces dominion on the South. We are compelled to take the scepter of power. So here, after these first couple of victories in 1861, a lot of Southerners are thinking, we've got this in the bag. We're winning. All we got to do is keep pushing and we'll topple the North and we'll have our independence and we'll be a separate country. But what's going to emerge out of this is a lot more complex than that. As this map kind of points out, the Confederacy is huge, but the North is going to come up with a strategy for tearing the Confederacy apart. In the middle of the country, armies are going to be raised out in the west in places like Illinois and Missouri, and they're going to be sent down the Mississippi River to tear the Confederacy apart from east to west. In the east, more armies are going to be raised by the North to start marching on the new capital of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia, just about 50 miles from the federal capital of Washington, D.C. And once that's done, Northern armies are going to keep marching down to tear apart the Confederacy that way. Out on the oceans, the U.S. Navy is going to blockade the South, make it impossible for them to raise money to get munitions. Now, it's not going to be airtight. There are a lot of Southern ships are going to make it through with supplies both ways to raise money and to bring them into the South. But the United States Navy is going to do a good job of slowing all that down and making it very difficult for the South. So in the end, strategies start to kind of emerge. For a lot of Southerners, it's just hold the North off. Just hang on until the North gets tired, right? Just keep pushing them back. For the North, it's you have to go in, you have to crush this Confederacy. That is a big task. That is a lot of land. It means that they're going to need to raise lots and lots of armies, that this is going to be an incredibly expensive war in both blood and treasure. So to kind of sum things up here really quick, right? One thing we have to understand is in 1860, because of the Republican Party's growth in the North, Lincoln's going to be president no matter what. You can add up all of his opponents together, both popular vote-wise and electoral college-wise, and Lincoln is still president no matter what. But he doesn't have a majority of the population with him. A lot of Northerners, not all of them, but a lot of Northerners and virtually all Southerners vote against him, right? They vote for somebody else. Whether they want to or not, they will. So Lincoln's gonna not be having a mandate here, right? He's got to find a mandate. What is the thing that he can latch onto that kind of combines a lot of people behind him, holding the country together? That the South can't just walk away when it doesn't like an election result, right? So for the South, this means that they do feel they have to walk away, though, right? Because they have the North in complete control of the federal government. They feel that it's just a matter of time before slavery is gotten rid of. So what is going to happen next is the key, right? Is the South going to win? Is secession going to be real? Is the Confederacy born? Or is the North going to win and transform the South and get rid of slavery and make the South look like the North? That's what we'll have to look at next.